We'll get started in just a moment. We're waiting for Ranking Member Neugebauer, who'll be filling in for Dr. Ehlers, who'll be here very, very shortly. This hearing will now come to order. We've been joined by Roscoe Bartlett, Dr. Bartlett, and also by Dr. Jerry McNerney as well. I'm Congressman Brian Baird. This is a topic that I am tremendously excited about. It has a proud history in our country. It has great importance to our future. And we've been learning a lot about the topic, and today we have an extraordinarily distinguished panel of guests. One of the things I'm excited about this reason is that if you look at the history of America, one of the most famous Americans, maybe the most famous worldwide American, apart perhaps from George Washington, of course, was Ben Franklin. And it wasn't because of Poor Richard's Almanac. It was because of his scientific work. And I am searching the annals of Ben Franklin's writings for a substitute quote for Tennyson up here, because Tennyson didn't have a lot to do with U.S. science, last I checked. But we believe passionately on this committee, and particularly this subcommittee, that science and diplomacy should intermix, that they should be co-equals and co-partners, and an essential part of the soft power strategy of this country. And I'm sure that that is a position likely shared by our witnesses here today. And we've had a series of hearings. We had a very productive hearing about the whole issue of visas and how student visas and other visas relate and can either add to or detract from our efforts to attract science and to collaborate with other countries. Today we want to hear about different topics. We want to, obviously related, but we want to hear about how various departments within the government, various agencies, perform the collaborative mission and the mission of sharing scientific information. As I've read the testimony, and thank you all, it's outstanding testimony, very insightful, the take-home message for me is, on a very positive front, to be honest, I think our country had kind of we've gone through periods, as probably any effort does, but we had been for a while in maybe a bit of a dip in our profile and our commitment to scientific diplomacy. But I think that's on the upsurge by a darn sight, and the people here today are largely responsible for that, and I thank you for that and give you great credit for it, and pledge the support of this committee in further developing that. But at the same time, it's fairly clear that there are some areas that we ought to at least consider ways in which we can further enhance this mission. Issues of lines of authority within the various agencies, issue of explicit mission in terms of certain agencies, issues of funding, where funding comes from, how it is allocated, to what extent is funding able to be used not just to fund U.S. scientists, but to fund collaborative efforts, issues about where we may need more or different personnel, for example, in embassies abroad. Do we need a stronger science profile in our international embassies? Do we need designated people at multiple agencies who are in charge of the international exchange and scientific diplomacy? These are some of the core questions that have emerged as I've looked at your testimony and others and experts, and we look very much forward to your comments today. I would also say that I personally believe that that science as a role in our diplomacy, particularly in areas of the Middle East, can be especially valuable. And my colleagues have sometimes heard this story, but I'll share it because it was so impressive. I was at the World Economic Forum in Sharm el-Sheikh, and I was with my good friend, and we all know chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee, Howard Berman. And we were meeting people there, and we met, I think a woman was Egyptian. She had a headscarf on, and we were just doing informal introductions. And we said, this is Howard Berman. He's from Southern California. Her response was to raise a proud fist in the air and say, I'm a mighty Trojan. Now, she did not say, oh, how do you do? I went to school in Southern California. No. This woman was a mighty Trojan. She had just totally internalized the commitment and the values of a U.S. school. That sort of passion and friendship and intrinsic understanding of our system is literally invaluable. We can talk about where the budget lines are and how much we spend, etc. But to have people internationally who not only know our system, but love it and have a personal commitment to it is the measure. We just cannot measure the merit of that. And I will tell you that was one striking example of literally thousands. And I know all of you have had those same experiences. You've traveled the world. It is something we must not lose in this country and in our scientific mission. And so this committee, certainly this member, is very, very committed to that. With that, I want to introduce Mr. Neugebauer, who is filling in as ranking member for Vern Ehlers. Dr. Ehlers is very sorry he couldn't be here. As you know, he was chair of this committee previously and has a long long and strong history of commitment to international science cooperation. Mr. Neubauer, thank you.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and good morning. And Dr. Ehlers is sorry he could not be here to greet this esteemed to hear these great witnesses today and hear their testimony, but he's giving his own testimony before a committee this morning and cannot be here. Hopefully, we will have the benefit of his presence shortly. But in the meantime, I ask unanimous consent that his opening statement be inserted into the record.
Without objection.
The issue of international science and technology cooperation is one of importance to this nation. This committee spends a significant amount of time talking about American science and technology developments and improvements in terms of global competitiveness. That is, should be and is necessary if we're going to remain ahead of the innovation curve. We do not spend as much time talking or hearing about global cooperation, collaboration when it comes to science and technology, but we are actively involved in these equally important endeavors. And I commend the chairman for his interest in this topic and for calling this hearing today. I'm pleased to see that we have such a distinguished panel before us this morning to give us an update on what their agencies are doing and any challenges or obstacles that they may be facing when it comes to international cooperation. I thank you for coming, and I look forward to your testimony, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you, Mr. Neugebauer. If there are members who wish to submit additional opening statements, your statements will be added to the record at this point. At this time, it's my great privilege to introduce our witnesses. Dr. John Marburger is the Director of the Office of Science and Technology Policy, and in that role serves as the President's Chief Science Advisor. Dr. Arden Bement is the Director of the National Science Foundation, one of only 3 research agencies with explicit international programs. Dr. Nina Fedoroff recently became the 3rd Science and Technology Advisor to the Secretary of State and the first to serve also as S&T Advisor to the Administrator of USID. Mr. Jeff Miotke is the Deputy Assistant Director of State for Science, Space, and Health in the Bureau of Oceans and International Environmental and Science Affairs. And Mr. Michael O'Brien is the Assistant Administrator for External Relations at the National Aeronautics and Space Administration and responsible for managing NASA's international agreement across its mission directorates. As our witnesses know, spoken testimony is limited to 5 minutes, but we're fairly flexible in this committee, and then we'll follow with 5 minutes of questioning on each side. And at this point, we'll open our first round of requests. We'll open the hearing. Mr. Dr. Marburger, please. Thank you for being here.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Neugebauer, members of the subcommittee. I'm quite glad to be here, having served on the faculty of University of Southern California for many years, and dean there. I think of myself as a Trojan as well. In your invitation, you asked 2 multi-part questions that I've answered somewhat implicitly in my written testimony. And in my oral remarks this morning, I want to address those specific questions very succinctly, and I'd be glad to provide more detail in response to your questions. My written testimony responds mainly to question 1. What is the role of OSTP in fostering international science and technology cooperation and in coordinating federal activities? And also, what is OSTP's role relative to that of the Department of State? These are important questions. We try to be clear about them in my office. In brief, OSTP provides support to agencies with respect to their international science and technology activities, and to the Department of State with respect to its overall responsibility for coordinating all international activities. We do not seek to duplicate or replace the State Department in this responsibility, nor does OSTP establish diplomatic priorities or objectives, and we actively discourage other agencies from taking actions that may infringe upon the State Department's responsibility in this regard. On the other hand, I actively discourage the Department of State from taking actions that imply or entail commitments with international partners that require expenditures within other departments and agencies without prior consultation and arrangement with those departments and agreements about the source of funds and the responsibility for the programs. The State Department does this, and I think they do it well. The second question asks how the administration sets priorities for international science and technology cooperation, and is there any regular forward-looking process by which goals are set by OSTP or by the National Science and Technology Council, NSTC, that's you referred to. And then finally, what is my response to the National Science Board's recommendation to reconstitute a committee on International Science, Engineering, and Technology under NSTC. Well, as I explained in my written testimony, science is intrinsically international, and the administration expects each agency to include such international components in its programs as are appropriate to their objectives. The current annual priority guidance to departments and agencies from my office and OMB specifically refers to international activity in a bulleted priority, and I'm quoting from that document, to encourage interdisciplinary research efforts on complex scientific frontiers and strengthen international partnerships to accelerate the progress of science across borders. That is currently an administration priority to the agencies. OSTP does not consider the international dimension of science and technology as distinct or separable from specific technical areas such as nanotechnology or nuclear physics or planetary science. We look to other countries for help in achieving our missions and goals for those kinds of areas. The administration does not set priorities for international cooperation independently of priorities in the various areas of science, except to achieve diplomatic objectives, and that priority is established by the State Department. OSTP assists the State Department in identifying agencies and topics appropriate for achieving diplomatic objectives on a case-by-case basis. Agencies are responsible for determining what international capabilities are appropriate to seek in support of agency goals, and all agencies with significant science capabilities do have international offices. So, in the view that I've described, the question of goal setting takes a somewhat different significance than your question implies. The only appropriate top-down goal setting for international programs is either very broad, as in international collaborations are viewed very positively, or they are related to foreign policy objectives which are promulgated by the State Department, in which case they do not necessarily refer specifically to science topics. In my view, more specific top-down goal setting is counterproductive and encourages the making of international commitments that are mismatched to agency budgets and programs. And consequently, I do not agree with the recommendation to form a committee on international science, engineering, and technology under the NSTC. The meetings and products of such a committee would be duplicative or existing topic-specific activities that are conducted in connection with the current vigorous program of international collaborations. I met with the National Science Board committee that made this recommendation and advised strongly against it. While I agree with much in that National Science Board report, I do not agree with this recommendation. So in conclusion, I want to emphasize that science is strongly international almost by definition, and federal departments and agencies do participate broadly and actively in international collaborations. It is appropriate to fund science programs to achieve diplomatic objectives, and those objectives are defined by the Department of State, and the programs are carried out by agencies consistent with their roles and responsibilities. My office acts as a broker to support state in these objectives and as a coordinator of the technical component of official activities such as science and technology agreements and joint commissions. Resources and staffing does exist to perform these functions, and I believe they are being performed well overall. So I thank you for the opportunity to make these remarks and refer you to my written testimony, which I would request be made part of the record.
And Ranking Member Neugebauer and distinguished members of the subcommittee, thank you for this opportunity to discuss NSF's role in international science and engineering cooperation. For more than 55 years, NSF has recognized the central role that international partnerships play in achieving America's research and development objectives. The Foundation has a rich history of connecting U.S. scientists and engineers with international collaborators across all sectors and disciplines to leverage intellectual capabilities. I believe through such international partnerships and leadership with international agencies, NSF fosters trust, and understanding essential to advancing diplomatic relations. Today, international leadership roles are prominent in my portfolio as NSF Director. I represent the United States at the annual meeting of the heads of research councils for the G8 countries, and I serve as a member of the U.S. National Commission for UNESCO. Deputy Director Olson is also active in UNESCO and OECD's Global Science Forum and serves as the Vice Chair of the Board of the Human Frontier Science Program. NSF's assistant directors and office directors also help establish solid working relationships with counterpart agencies and organizations abroad. For example, as director of the NSF's Office of Polar Programs, Dr. Carl provides leadership in the International Polar Year, the Arctic Council, and consultative meetings with the Antarctic Treaty. Through such roles, NSF leadership interacts directly with heads of states, ministers, and other principals to catalyze intellectual exchange on global issues, develop bilateral and multilateral agreements, and foster international science and engineering capacity. NSF leadership also provides guidance on international research and related interagency collaborations through its work on the National Science and Technology Council. Moreover, NSF's overseas offices in Beijing, Paris, and Tokyo proactively promote relations between the United States and international science and engineering communities. NSF also fosters international cooperation through the support of the U.S. portion of international research and education projects. The Foundation effectively partners with almost every country in the world. Our range of international activities presents what I believe is a rich portfolio. Activities range from individual awards to student fellowships for study abroad, to centers and networks, to multinational research programs, and to large international research facilities. All of NSF's directorates and research offices fund international science and engineering activities. The Education and Human Resources Directorate also has fostered extraordinary collaborations around STEM education and human resource development. Additionally, NSF's Office of International Science and Engineering, or OISE, supports several programs that specifically fund U.S. scientists and engineers engaged in international work. One such program, the Partnerships for International Research and Education, or PIRE, enables U.S. institutions to establish partnerships with international groups. PIRE has supported institutional-level research collaborations with more than 40 countries. For example, the PIRE Africa Array Project brought together U.S. and African geoscientists as well as students to study seismological and volcanic activity in Africa. This program has now grown to include collaborators from more than 20 U.S., African, and European universities, in addition to large corporations, to advance the understanding of Earth's mantle dynamics. In recent years, OISE has expanded emphasis on linkages between U.S. scientists and those in developing countries. Specifically, OISE hired a new program manager for developing countries to expand these collaborations. This program manager, along with NSF leadership, has initiated dialogue with 12 domestic and 20 international institutions who can co-fund the developing countries portion of these projects. OISE also works with international counterpart agencies to introduce them to the Foundation's merit review process and organizational structure. Many organizations, particularly those in developing countries, look to NSF as a model on how to run a competitive merit review research council. The United Arab Emirates, Saudi Arabia, and China will soon send representatives to NSF to study our methods of operation. Mr. Chairman and members of the subcommittee, thank you again for this opportunity to testify on a subject of particular importance to NSF.
Thank you, Dr. Bement. We've been joined by Mr. Bilbray from California and Eddie Bernice Johnson from Texas. I thank them for joining. Dr. Fedoroff.
Thank you. And distinguished members of the subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to discuss science diplomacy at the State Department. My written testimony describes what we do in response to your questions. I take this opportunity to tell you why we do it. New York Times columnist Tom Friedman has attracted a great deal of attention with his declaration that the world is flat. By this he means that the Internet, communication technology, and globalization have put all peoples of the world on an equal economic footing. Yet despite the extraordinary increase in our ability to communicate and access information, we all know that the world is far from flat, even metaphorically. Countries that cannot feed their people or provide them with economic opportunities are susceptible to extremist ideologies, autocratic rule, and human rights abuses. The still growing human population, rising affluence in emerging economies, and many other factors are pushing the global prices of edible oils and grains to unprecedented highs. Global climate change is expected to make matters worse. Encouraging, and more importantly, assisting countries to use science and technology to build food security, manage land and water resources, and create knowledge-based economic opportunities are essential goals for U.S. diplomacy and U.S. national security. Indeed, they're a central element of the Secretary's Transformational Diplomacy Initiative. Let me give you just one small personal example of science diplomacy from my experience before I came to state. I'm a plant molecular biologist and geneticist. In 2004, I published a book on the science behind genetically modified plants, generally known as GM crops or GMOs. Not long after, I received an email from a junior Foreign Service officer in the American Embassy in Bangladesh inviting me to come and speak about GMOs. Bangladesh is a poor country with a limited amount of arable land and a still growing population. It badly needs contemporary science to increase its agricultural output. Caught between U.S. acceptance and Europe's continued rejection of GM crops, Bangladesh had not developed its own GM policy. The conference opened an important dialogue among scientists in our country and theirs, diplomats and government officials, as well as the local press, in the effort to distinguish fact from fiction in this highly charged area and move forward. There is a growing recognition that science and technology are and will increasingly be the drivers of the successful economies of the 21st century. From countries to companies, today's organizations are shaped by their expertise in science, technology, and engineering. Improving the welfare and stability of the poorest nations will require a concerted effort by the developed world to address the underlying disparities in access to the education, the science, and the technology essential for economic growth. The world also faces common threats: climate change, energy and water shortages, infectious diseases, and environmental degradation. Such threats are blind to political boundaries. The birds that spread avian flu don't apply for visas or stop at border crossings. Addressing global challenges necessitates international scientific cooperation. Scientists speak a common language, making it possible for members of ideologically divergent societies to cooperatively address the problems confronting all of us. Finally, some types of science are inherently international in scope and collaborative by necessity. The objective of the International Thermonuclear Experimental Reactor, ITER as it is generally known, is to harness the power of nuclear fusion as a new and viable energy source. ITER is an international scientific cooperation among key science leaders: Japan, Korea, China, the European Union, India, Russia, and the United States. The recent elimination of funding for the FY08 U.S. contribution to the ITER project has made our allies question our commitment and credibility in international cooperative ventures. It is perhaps important to remember that in an earlier era, science diplomacy was an important avenue of communication between the Soviet Union and the U.S., credited by many with preventing a flashover of the Cold War. In a complex, multipolar world, relations are more challenging, the threats perhaps greater, and the need for engagement even more compelling. I thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Fedoroff. Mr. Miotke.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member Neugebauer, distinguished members of this subcommittee. I welcome the opportunity to talk a little bit about how important S&T is to diplomacy. Although I have to say I'm now a little at a loss for words since your own comments and Dr. Fedoroff's have pretty much stolen my thunder. And Dr. Marburger, as usual, has described the role of State Department better than I can. I'm going to be asking him to write my work requirement statement. Thanks. Oh, I got myself into trouble. Nonetheless, I'm a diplomat. I get paid by the word, so I'm going to read my statement in any case. My last overseas tour in Hungary was a great example of the power of S&T to build bridges. My ambassador there, Nancy Branker, who many of you may know from the Komen Foundation, orchestrated an impressive breast cancer awareness campaign. GE was generous in its support of the initiative, making medical equipment and experts available. And so at the very time that we were working with Hungary in preparation for the coalition forces to move into Iraq, Ambassador Brinker engineered a massive outpouring of support for the embassy, and I believe that had very real implications for the level of support that we enjoyed from Hungary. As Dr. Fedoroff has noted also, S&T is also a fundamental pillar of development. Most, if not all, countries have realized that to create jobs and be competitive, they must accelerate the development of their knowledge and technology sectors. Our cooperation with them supports the establishment of science-based industries, encourages investments, highlights the importance of education, and promotes international dialogue on issues of global import. By sharing our expertise in an area of comparative strength, the United States demonstrates to other nations that we are interested in seeing them develop and flourish. This helps alleviate some of the misconceptions about U.S. motives. Science also drives diplomacy as well. This is certainly the case in the full range of my Bureau's issues, be it avian influenza, persistent organic pollutants, climate change, or nanotechnology. In each case, the scientific community alerted us to potential problems or concerns. That awareness then spawned an international process. As the international dialogue proceeds, the scientific community redefines and updates the parameters of the problem. Ideally, this ongoing scientific process helps achieve a consensus on an issue, or at least helps to narrow the political divide. In the best-known example, growing concern about climate change resulted not just in the negotiations under the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, but also in the periodic assessment process of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. The Department is applying S&T diplomacy in a strategic manner. In July 2005, Secretary Rice approved an initiative to increase S&T outreach to the countries in the Middle East, North Africa, and South Asia. The goal of this strategy is to enhance our relationships and to foster development in those countries by engaging more fully with their science and technology communities and by reaching out in particular to women and youth, including perhaps your Trojan. In approving this strategy, the Secretary recognized the promise of S&T to both advance American national interests and promote the freedom and dignity of others. Science and science education can play an important role in fostering dialogue, increasing innovation, and addressing poverty. S&T empowers people to raise themselves up by developing their own human and intellectual capacity. This empowerment gives hope, a natural enemy of extremism. I'm pleased to say that S&T diplomacy has been an all-hands effort at State. In addition to launching the Muslim outreach strategy, the Secretary has signed several S&T agreements, including Bulgaria and India, just to name a couple. Undersecretary of State for Democracy and Global Affairs, Paula Dobriansky, was the architect of our Muslim S&T outreach strategy, and she has led a number of S&T delegations, including the first to Libya since that country renounced nuclear weapons. OES Assistant Secretary Claudia McMurray has led S&T delegations to Morocco and Libya as well. Ambassador Reno Harnish, the OES Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary, has been extremely active speaking on S&T issues in the United States and abroad. And Dr. Fedoroff, of course, has been an invaluable addition to the S&T team at State. Actually, my only problem is figuring out why I need to come into the office every morning. Seriously, I thank you again for this opportunity, and I look forward to any questions you might have.
Yeah, there we go. Sorry. For 50 years, NASA has enjoyed the benefits of international cooperation, the direction for which is found in legislation that created NASA in 1958 and more recently in the U.S. Space Exploration Policy signed by the President in 2004. NASA's international cooperation has involved thousands of agreements, not only with spacefaring nations, but also with an increasing number of other countries that rely on the unique vantage point of space for their day-to-day activities such as resource management and disaster warning. International cooperation for NASA is mission-driven and pursued in accordance with guidelines that we have developed over the years. For example, such activities must have technical merit and demonstrated programmatic benefit to NASA, provide access to unique capabilities, or improve mission redundancy. And certainly, in all cases, they must be consistent with U.S. foreign policy objectives. Now, international cooperation in our 4 mission directorates covers a broad spectrum of activities. Currently, 2/3 of our roughly 300 active international agreements support the Science Mission Directorate, with more than half of nearly 50 current missions on orbit, including some level of international participation. In Earth science particularly, international cooperation is absolutely essential as we strive to understand the planet as an integrated system of land, sea, and atmospheric processes. In space operations, the premier example of international cooperation is obviously the International Space Station. This 15-nation partnership has worked for 2 decades on what may be the most complex international science and engineering project in history. Regarding future robotic and human exploration, NASA welcomes participation by other countries, and in fact, we expect it. We've already partnered with 13 space agencies to develop a global exploration strategy that expresses a shared vision among those participating agencies of the importance of space exploration to individual national objectives. I think it's safe to say that NASA's international activities also promote foreign policy interests. For example, the invitation to Russia to join the existing space station partnership in 1993 had an important U.S. foreign policy component. Over the years, the partnership has overcome a number of significant challenges, including the tragic loss of Space Shuttle Columbia, and now plays an ongoing positive role, in my view, in the relationship between the United States and its space station partners, one benefit of which certainly is their willingness to cooperate with the United States on future space exploration endeavors. Less dramatic international cooperation, and I guess that includes everything other than the International Space Station, can also have foreign policy benefits. In the area of remote sensing applications, for example, in collaboration with USAID and several other organizations, NASA supported the establishment of the Surveyor Operations Facility in Panama. Surveyor is a regional system used to monitor ecological changes and forecast severe events such as forest fires, tropical storms. 8 countries participate, and discussions are underway now for potential use of this particular model in East Africa. NASA carefully coordinates with other government agencies during the conceptual development and negotiation of international agreements. We believe we have an excellent basis for this coordination due to our long-standing effective relationships with OSTP, the Department of State, other agencies within the executive branch. Now, in the vast majority of cases, such as bilateral agreements with our traditional partners, the consultation and approval process is straightforward and relatively streamlined, in my view. In cases of potential cooperation with non-traditional partners, such as India, Korea, Ukraine, perhaps in the future even China, NASA clearly recognizes the requirement for detailed interagency and congressional coordination to ensure that overall U.S. government interests and any potential legal restrictions are fully addressed. In summary, international cooperation will continue to be fundamentally important to NASA as we seek opportunities for mutually beneficial cooperation around the world. Let me add that we are extremely proud at NASA of our international cooperation. It benefits NASA programs, it benefits the programs of our partners, has a positive impact around the world on the relations between the United States and those governments with whom we participate and cooperate in space. I'd be pleased to respond to any questions that you might have. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. O'Brien. We can tell we have a distinguished and experienced panel of witnesses. I think everybody came in within 15 seconds of the 5-minute mark, which is very rare here. We thank you for that, but we'll
Stopwatches are for.
we'll enjoy a good round of questions. Because Dr. McNerney's informed me he has to go to another meeting at 11, I want to make sure we get all members who have an opportunity to ask questions. I'll yield my time to Dr. McNerney and then reclaim it after it already goes. Dr. McNerney?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm not a Trojan, but you let me take cuts in line, so I appreciate that. Historically, the United States has been recognized as an international scientific leader, and one of the focuses of this committee has been to make sure that we retain that leadership position, even as countries like China and India produce more and more engineers and scientists. Dr. Fedoroff, do you think that the United States continues to be viewed as a scientific leader, or is our role diminishing in some way that we should be aware of and take strong action about?
I think we are continue to be recognized as leaders, but indeed other countries are very much seeking partnerships with us, and their own scientific establishments are increasing. So I think that there is no question but that the primacy of the U.S. is not what it was. I do not think that that's a negative. I think that's a positive. But I think that what I am experiencing as I travel is that people want to be seen, scientists of other countries want to be seen as partners, as collaborators, not as recipients of our wisdom. So I think that's a very important point. The second important point is that we have for half a century been the prime attractor of graduate students, talented people from around the world. We have to become aware of the fact that that situation is changing. Countries around the world are recognizing the importance and competing with us. Our visa policies haven't helped that. But that aside, the value of the best and the brightest for economic development is recognized the world around. So today the challenge is more building capacity, educational capacity everywhere. It's not that we're short of people. It is that we are short of highly trained people. Thank you.
Thank you for that answer. Dr. Miotke? Am I pronouncing that correctly?
It's most commonly pronounced Jeff, but
Jeff.
The last name is Maki. Jeff works for me.
All right, Jeff. Compared to other, thank you. Compared to other industrialized nations, the United States is dragging its feet with regard to limiting greenhouse gas emissions. And both yourself and Dr. Fedoroff did mention global warming as a concern. Do you think that is hurting our international reputation as a premier science country? And what should we do about that if that's the case?
Well, I am now going to venture a bit into Dr. Marburger's area of expertise, but let me just say that I've been a climate negotiator off and on since the 80s. And I don't see that our policies on climate change have an impact on the prestige that others assign to American scientists. On the contrary, most of the IPCC process, and Dr. Marburger, please correct me if I'm incorrect here, is driven by American scientists and American science. So I think we're on the cutting edge of pushing. We're not the only ones who are doing this research, but certainly I think we're doing more than others. And countries realize this in across the board, I think. Please do, Dr. Marburger.
So there's a disconnect then between what the administration is doing and what the American scientific community is recommending. And you don't have to answer that if you don't want, but that's implied in what you said.
Yeah, I have no self-control, so I will answer it. I don't see the disconnect. I believe the president when he says that we will learn and act and then learn and act again. And if you see particularly the MEM process that is now underway, as well as a multitude of partnerships that are based on developing new technologies, new clean technologies with countries that represent 80% of the total greenhouse gas emissions around the world. I think, in fact, that they are pretty active and that it's been informed by the science. One of the first acts of the Bush administration in their first term was to turn to the National Academies of Science and ask for an assessment of the science of climate change at that point. And to my mind, they've acted accordingly based on the information they're getting from the scientific community.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have one more question, but I think I better yield back at this point.
Thank you, Dr. McNerney. Mr. Neugebauer.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have, I'm going to take, I had two different questions, but I'm going to roll it into one question. You know, a lot of folks would say, what is the value of our international participation in science diplomacy? In other words, are we exporting, American tax dollars? What's the value of doing that? And they would, the reciprocal of that, they would say, well, why shouldn't we reserve American research dollars for, American scientists? So how would, and that's a question that I hear a lot about when we talk about diplomacy and that everybody wants to be our friend as long as we're sending American dollars over there. So I'll just kind of go down the panel here and tell me in your own words what you think the value of that is and what you would say to someone at Texas Tech University that's out there competing for these research funds and they hear these funds are going to other parts of the world. And I'm just, Dr. Marburger, I'll start with you.
Yes, sir. I believe that American objectives are served and should be served by investments that we make in science in other countries. Shortly after I came to Washington, I prepared a list of 10 reasons why we should fund international science that I would be happy to share with the subcommittee, and make part of my testimony. To be brief, first of all, well, I think I'd better just submit this for the record. The important thing is...
Go ahead and expand on it a little bit. If we need to give you more time, we'll do that.
One of the reasons is to provide access to the frontiers of science wherever they may be. The U.S. doesn't have tropical forests. We don't have the South Pole. We don't have access to the Southern Hemisphere for astronomy. So there are good reasons for providing access to the rest of the world. Another is to augment our own human capital, as we have done historically, to go out and reach out to the best talent in the world to find out what they can do to help us, sometimes invite them to our countries, but we have to be out there. To strengthen U.S. science through visits and exchanges and by bringing in outstanding scientists from other countries. To increase U.S. national security, as Dr. Fedoroff pointed out so eloquently, national security and economic prosperity by fostering the improvement of conditions in other countries. It's a direct benefit. To accelerate the progress of science across a broader front than we may wish to fund. There are some areas of science that are very expensive, and we would like to know, but if other countries are willing to join us in an adventure, whether it's particle physics or nuclear physics or space exploration, then we should reach out to them to broaden our own frontiers. To address U.S. interests of a global nature, which the U.S. alone cannot afford to address. Climate change is a good one, and various enterprises, huge enterprises like the International Polar Year that we're now involved. We have a stake in these investigations, but they're so large that we enjoy having other countries involved. To discharge obligations in connection with treaties. and certainly to increase U.S. prestige and influence with other nations. So these are some of the things that we really do get out of science. And in my testimony, I emphasize the fact that my office, OSTP, is primarily concerned with the science and the ability of the agencies like the National Science Foundation or NASA to do that science as well as it can be done on an absolute global standard. So we look to see if the agencies are taking advantage of international assets. When it comes to diplomatic objectives, the primary agency would be USAID. And we are very encouraged by the fact that USAID now has Dr. Fedoroff as a science advisor, and I hope that practice continues in future administrations. So this is a somewhat long answer perhaps, and there's more in my statement.
Dr. Marburger will make that available. And I think this is such a central question that I'm going to take some discretion here and ask other members of the panel to address it if they wish.
It's already been mentioned that countries around the world are investing more in higher education and research and development because they now recognize this drives the economy in a knowledge society. It's not preordained that scientists in the U.S. are always going to know where the frontier is at any given time. It may be somewhere else in another part of the world. So having broad-ranging networks where they have collaborations with scientists around the world is critically important. Also, we don't have all the best research facilities in the United States. CERN is an example, the Large Hadron Collider at CERN. So having access to special facilities is also critically important. It's also important for our workforce for the 21st century that we have people in leadership positions in science and engineering to have a broad international connection. And that's true even for our graduate students, because those who go into industry, for example, who have language skills, who have some interconnection with other scientific groups around the world are considered to be very valuable. Because most global companies now are trying to seek where the best technology may be that they can capture and add it to their internal innovation system. They can add their own know-how, their own patents, and gain and advance in the marketplace. So just for self-serving interest in being able to develop our workforce for the 21st century, having a very strong international program is critically important. I might add just one other thing. One of the greatest things we contribute to developing countries in the world is building their human resource capacity through exchanges and working with scientists in getting technical assistance and learning how to use sophisticated instrumentation, and also in jointly conducting field studies where they can share information and knowledge in how their natural environment is changing. There are many areas where we are really making a major impact on developing countries. I might add that NSF currently, even in sub-Saharan Africa, in Africa altogether, there are 57 nations. We have active collaborations and active projects with 40 out of those 57, which is just an example.
We live in a single, very interconnected world. In some measure, the violence that we see against us is rooted in the disparities in our way of life and those of the poorest countries, which are immediately obvious to everyone because of contemporary telecommunications. We ignore that at our peril. It is in our best interest to raise the educational levels around the world to help other countries create the kinds of opportunities that are, in fact, the purview of the developed world today. We cannot afford to do that. We I think in recent decades have increasingly realized how interconnected the entire world is. The question of infectious diseases is a critical one today. We can't wall ourselves off. We could devise a strategy where we would infiltrate everybody in a very traditional sense, but in fact, our best strategy is to help others interconnect the entire world surveillance system for infectious diseases and help build the capacity on the ground. Let me just give you one example. Extremely drug-resistant TB is a problem. It came to our attention because we had an American citizen who took off to get married and have his honeymoon in Europe. But a few days ago, last week, in the New York Times, there was an article about South Africa, which has had a huge outbreak of XDR-TB. There are hundreds of patients in isolation because this is an extremely infectious disease. And frankly, they have so little in the way of support and personnel and drugs that those patients know that they will only go out of that hospital dead. They broke out at Christmas time. They broke out at Easter time just to be with their families. That's a problem that can come to roost for us. It's time to think globally in this area as well as many others. That's just
Yeah, I mentioned the outreach effort in Hungary, and I think that's a good example of how S&T cooperation can have broader foreign policy benefits for the United States. I won't belabor that point. I want to add a little bit to what Dr. Fedoroff said as well, and I think pandemic flu is another example of an area in which we cooperate because, no pun intended, avian flu could come home to roost. Also, I have been consistently surprised at where we found some cutting-edge work being done. There's an African country in particular that is doing interesting work producing solar panels on plain copying paper. And they're also doing using nanotechnology for novel ways to purify water in mines. This is something that my people tell me is not being done elsewhere. So there's almost inevitably some benefit to the United States in cooperating on a particular area. And in fact, mutual benefit is one of the underlying principles of our S&T agreements across the board. And then finally, let me also again highlight something that Dr. Fedoroff said, and that is S&T is a fundamental pillar of development. Without it, we are assisting people over the short term, but if we're building S&T capability, we're helping them to truly develop over the long term. And if we want to close the gaps, or if we want to prevent the gaps between the United States and other countries, my experience is primarily in Africa, and the gap is huge there. If we want to narrow that gap, we have to invest in S&T with them.
Mr. Chairman, I would just respond to one part of the question, which I think asked, why are we sending money overseas? Wouldn't it be better to keep it here in the United States? NASA, the way we cooperate, is generally almost uniquely on a no exchange of funds basis. So in those 300 agreements that we have, all but a couple of them involve NASA funding its own contribution, our partners funding their contributions, and then reaping the collective benefits. There are only a couple of occasions where we actually are sending money overseas, and that's for services that we need and can't get elsewhere.
Thanks for the question. I think it's central. I'm inclined to share an analogy offered by former Governor of Colorado, Rayburn, and I'm a little bit hesitant with Dr. Fedoroff here because it may not be scientifically apt, but former Governor Romer used to describe a fellow who every year his corn won the prize at the state fair. Bartlett may have some insights in this as well. He won the prize at the state fair, blue ribbon, and the very first thing he would do is distribute the corn seed to all the farmers around him. People said, why are you doing that? Because these guys are your competition. reply was, you understand that the way the wind carries pollen from corn, pollen from the fields around my field are going to blow some of that pollen into my cornfield. And if the guys around me don't have good corn, I'm going to have bad corn down the road. And that's part of what you're describing. I think the other side of it, though, that is lacking from Governor Romer's analogy is that sometimes the other guy has better corn. And if we don't collaborate in that way, and corn's obviously the metaphor, whether that's any aspect of scientific research, we tend parochially to assume that we're always at the cutting edge. We can gain a great deal from other countries. And one of the fun but also challenging realizations as one travels and studies international science is sometimes folks are well ahead of us, and it's to our benefit if we don't collaborate now. When the time to collaborate comes back the other direction, people may say, hey, you weren't there with us, and so there's this mutual benefit. I think it's a central question. We all need to be able to answer that for our taxpayers who have every reason to ask a question. Dr. Fedoroff?
Yeah, I'd like to add one thing, and that is that probably 20, 25 years ago, USAID was educating something like close to 20,000 students a year. Those individuals are now back, often as ministers, as people in high places around the world. Today, I think that number is less than 1,000. China is educating 10,000 Africans. Less than 1,000 USAID supported students from Africa as compared with 10,000. We go around the world and we speak English. If we do not maintain our ability, our educational support, the next generation will not be speaking English.
I think that is very eloquently said. I don't think most Americans are aware of those numbers, and it's absolutely true when you travel the world. Let me, if I may, ask a question following up on this. So if we agree that there's merit in this, what do we need to do to further enhance this issue? What are the obstacles remaining? What takes us to the next level and improves this?
There's a change in many countries in the world. Until fairly recently, most of the research was done at federally supported institutions in most nations. There's a movement to put much more capability in universities and to build higher education, to integrate education with research, as we've been doing in this country traditionally for many, many years. As a result, what we're finding is that many countries are modeling the National Science Foundation and setting up a National Research Council that mimics the National Science Foundation. For example, I can mention Turkey, France, Japan, Ireland, Russia, and more recently the United Arab Emirates and the King Abdulaziz City for Science and Technology in Saudi Arabia, and many more. They come to the National Science Foundation. And we invite them. We have an open door for them to show them how we do merit review, how we operate, what our policies are, and then they take that back and build it into their programs. Now, why do I use that as an example? The more research councils around the world that are normed, if you will, according to the National Science Foundation, the easier our relationships are, the lower the barriers, and the more opportunities we have for cooperative research. That's happening at a very rapid rate.
So I'd like to generalize that very articulate answer from Dr. Bement. The idea is to have receptor sites in the other countries. And there are many countries that would like to be our partners that don't have the capability of doing so. I believe that one of the most valuable aspects of the Secretary's initiative for transformational diplomacy is that it can build receptor sites that make it possible for these other countries to participate with us. So there's somewhat of a chicken and egg problem here. It isn't a question of our just coming in and dumping money in. It is necessary to have a level of sophistication within those other countries and a base capacity. And this is a function of USAID. I think it's important, and it's one of the reasons that I'm glad to see the direction of increased science advice into USAID. I think it will help.
I'm going to actually yield at this point. Recognize Dr. Bartlett.
Thank you very much, and thank you for your testimony. I'm caught on the horns of a dilemma. For a long number of years, the United States has been preeminent in science, math, and engineering. And the best and brightest of the world have flocked to our universities as scientists and students. I think it's no accident that during those same years we were the world's undisputed military and economic superpower. I remember a few years ago I sat with a number of the top scientists in the little country of Georgia, desperately poor. And I thought, gee, with the limited money that we have in this country, wouldn't it go a whole lot further if we were collaborating, working with these scientists and putting some money there? As you know, during the last several years, every year we have committed less and less of our resources to basic science and R&D. I'm a farmer. I represent farmers, and that's exactly the equivalent of eating your seed corn. I have a lot of farmers. None of them are dumb enough to eat their seed corn, but that's precisely what we've been doing. The dilemma that I face is that we're 1 person out of 22 in the world, and we have 1/4 of all the good things in the world. We use 1/4 of the world's energy. Now, what do I do? China today will graduate 6 times as many engineers as we graduate. India will graduate 3 times as many engineers as we graduate. And about half of our engineers are Chinese and Indian students, aren't they? How are we going to maintain this preeminence in the world where this 1 person in 22 has 1/4 of all the good things in the world, particularly challenging? Since I believe that the world now is at the point of the maximum production of fossil fuel energy. By the way, for everybody in the world to live as well as you and I live, they would have to have the equivalent of 300 people turning the cranks and running the industry that provides the amenities that represent our quality of life. Because that's the amount of fossil fuel energy that each of us consumes today. The work output of 300 people. That energy just won't be there. If I want to maintain for my kids and my grandkids, I have 10 kids and 16 grandkids and 2 great-grandkids. I'd like them to live as well as I'm living. If I'm going to maintain this superiority in this country, how do we do that? With a diminishing supply of energy, with the challenge of science, math, and engineering in the rest of the world. How do we do that?
We're now in a knowledge-driven economy, much less so resource-driven. Knowledge is the sort of thing that when you change it, it doesn't exchange it. Your share doesn't deplete. It actually enhances. So that there's a tremendous leveraging power in the exchange of knowledge. The critical factor is what you do with that knowledge and how successful you are in reducing that knowledge into products and services that are useful to society at large. And the key to that is to have a very strong entrepreneurial and innovation-driven system, and to have very creative people doing the research and finding ways to apply the research. I think at present we do that better than any other country in the world. We're the teachers, but other countries in the world are learning and learning very rapidly. So we have to be more agile in the future. We have to I think, pay particular attention to whether or not we're getting to be a complacent society instead of really recognizing the trends and doing something about it.
Well, could I answer your question directly? And that is, imagine a world in which you could live as well as you do, using energy much more efficiently, and simultaneously through the kinds of knowledge building that Dr. Bement has described, help the rest of the world live better.
When I drove to work this morning, more than half the cars that shared the road with me were SUVs and pickup trucks with one person in them.
They sure
It would
are.
be really nice if we could move to a more efficient world.
We could do that, something
wouldn't it?
about that.
Yes.
I think it will take cultural changes. I think it will take technological changes. But I think we ignore learning those lessons at our.
Guys, we face some huge challenges. This is exhilarating for me, Mr. Chairman, because there's no exhilaration like the exhilaration of meeting and overcoming a big challenge, and boy, do we have one. Thank you very much.
Well said, Dr. Bartlett. Eddie Bernice-Johnson.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I'm sorry I was a little late, and I'd like to ask unanimous consent to put my statement in the record. As a follow-up to the line of questioning, my concern goes back, I guess, a little bit further. We are not preparing an adequate number of young people for our future. And I'd like each of you to comment on what you are doing or what you have done to address this issue.
So I'll go first. This administration is very concerned about the quality of education from preschool up throughout the lives of our citizens, and worked very hard early in the Bush administration to pass laws, No Child Left Behind, and augment that initiative with further initiatives, some of which were captured in the President's American Competitiveness Initiative, which had a strong education component. And of course, the President signed the America Competes Act, which this committee had something important input on, which also had strong educational components. I believe it is important for us to pay attention to the quality of the education that we deliver to American young men and women, and my office has participated strongly in interagency programs to understand exactly which steps have to be taken to improve the quality of educational experience, particularly in math and science. We support the Department of Education in their efforts to form panels and study the situation and try to identify the best avenues for research on how children learn. And we support agencies like the National Science Foundation that have systematic programs for studying how people learn science and mathematics, and they sponsor pilot programs in schools to try to learn best practices. So I believe that I certainly agree that education is a primary pillar of strength for our future national security as well as our economic competitiveness, and it is important for us to continue to support these important initiatives.
Does the President know that No Child Left Behind is not working?
I think the President understands that we've got a difficult problem that will only yield to persistence. We can't back away from the commitments that we've made to our children. We've got to keep pushing at this until we get it right.
Thank you.
Let me bring this to a more international orientation. I think you're pretty well aware of what we're doing in Math and Science Partnership and our informal education programs and our public education programs involving the internet, the media, as well as science museums. What we're discovering is that as we provide undergraduate students an international experience. It generates a lot more enthusiasm for science, and it helps in retaining them through not only their undergraduate degree, but it encourages them to go on to a graduate degree. For that reason, we're also primarily concerned about the number of students of color who participate in international programs. And we discover that the percentage is lower than the number that are in higher education overall. So to stimulate that and to help address this challenge, we have provided or embedded in our Lewis-Stokes Alliances for minority participation international activities, and that, of course, is aimed at undergraduate students. Likewise, in our Alliances for Graduate Education in our professoriate program, we've also embedded international research experiences in that program for graduates and postdoc students as well.
Thank you.
I spent most of my life as an educator. I'm very familiar with this problem. Before coming to the State Department, I was at Penn State University, and one of the things that I did there as a director of a multidisciplinary organization was to support an outreach program that went all the way out into the schools and into the primary and secondary schools in science and technology. Just to give people experiences. But to come back to my present role, one of the things that has been considerably neglected is our international investment in tertiary education, that is college education. And one of the things that is happening this very month is that the Secretary of State, the Secretary of Spellings of Secretary of Education Spellings, and the U.S. Administrator for are convening a global Conference of University Presidents to address precisely how we get building the capacity in all countries for higher education.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
And if I could just add real briefly, too, we do make a special effort to reach out to young people in our S&T programs overseas. We're bringing a group of 16 Middle Eastern kids to NASA Space Camp in Alabama later this summer. We're teaching teachers in the Philippines to use GPS and other space-based technologies to teach geography to kids. We look for ways to reach out to youth during our S&T delegation trips overseas. My boss, Assistant Secretary McMurray, for instance, spoke to a group of kids in Morocco and tried to gin them up on science. And we're bringing a group of kids in from TJ to participate in Earth Day in the State Department, where the focus this year is going to be on science and technology work. And personally, my daughter wants to be a scientist, math and science in Africa.
And Mr. O'Brien, in addition to your comments, I'd also like to know what you're doing to be sure that NASA has prepared persons in the future. NASA in particular.
Thank you. And as far as education is concerned, NASA does have an education component that is largely domestically focused, and I'll be glad to give you a much more detailed response to that for the record. On the international aspect of that, we do partner with international counterparts. On occasion, an example of that would be that over at the Dutch, in cooperation with NASA and European Space Agency, have replicated a NASA program that we call it the Explorer School Program. There are a series of schools around the United States for which NASA, for a 3-year period, provides scientific education materials, trains the teachers that through a 3-year period they can focus on space science types of disciplines. Your second question, I'm sorry.
I'm wondering what type of investment or leadership does NASA engage in to be sure that you have the adequately prepared persons for the program?
For NASA?
Yes.
Well, I have to say that I can't really answer that directly. I can tell you that We at NASA have no problem getting educated people in NASA. And I'll give you an example. In our organization, which manages international cooperation, occasionally we are allowed to hire somebody. And we have a very bright group of about 50 people managing a lot of things at NASA. The last time that we were able to hire more than one person, we hired two, we had 450 applications. So we don't have a problem, in my view, at least in my area, attracting highly qualified, educated people to populate the NASA workforce.
Well, thank you. I know a couple of years ago that was real concern because most of the people there were nearing retirement age, and they didn't feel that was a.
Well, that's another issue. There are a lot of old people like me in NASA too. But.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr.
Thank you, Ms. Johnson. Mr. Bilbray.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I guess, Mr. Chairman, first of all, sort of answer Dr. Bartlett's question about how do we do this. I think we start off by saying what we don't do. We don't burn the world's food, consuming more energy than it produces, and call it green. We don't abandon international long-term strategy for energy, clean energy independence like ITER, which has been abandoned over the last two administrations, since '92. While the entire crisis of climate change has been talked about, on one hand by an administration, at the same time they were abandoning the long-term answer to addressing the problem. And the other issue we don't do is we don't continue to pay math and science teachers the same as a history or coach just because union rules preempt the well-being of this nation's future in science. In D.C., and now let's just face this, in D.C., we talk about education across this country. Washington, D.C. is our responsibility, like it or not. We may delegate authority, but not responsibility. Still in D.C., a science teacher does not get a bonus, does not get an incentive to stay in the educational institutions. And we sit here and talk about, we're concerned about it, but we're not willing to cross that political boundary of saying we're going to implement the responsibility here in D.C. and lead through example rather than cry about how bad the world is in the future. So now that I've gotten that off my chest, I just got to say, Doctor, your comment about ITER, I appreciate it. I do have to say one thing to you. I think that's an illusion by science to think that the language of the world is based on what science talks about. There was a period in the 19th century the Germans would be dominating. And if anybody who spends any time in third world countries like I do, let's all agree that our media impact in this world is extraordinary, and Americans don't understand it. You go to villages, they don't have electricity, but they have satellite dishes, and they're watching I Love Lucy and having it under subtitles. That impact, the American language will dominate until the Chinese start producing the movies. Okay, so let's just start off that. But the ITER program, can we bring, Doctor, would you articulate about how that is going to affect our relationship, not just in science, but in climate change and everything else, but the entire concept that this long-term strategy that the rest of the world is still recognizing because of our internal political structure, the lack of a special interest group lobbying for it, it's now been basically put on a back shelf. Could you articulate at all your feelings about that?
I'm going to defer that to Dr. Marburger. He's been centrally involved in it.
ITER is an important project for the future because it does capture a source of energy that doesn't produce large quantities of radioactive waste or CO2. And but it does require demonstration. There's still a further science step that that has to be taken that is now underway in France, and the U.S. rejoined a partnership that's trying to make this work in 2003, and we continue to be a partner despite the fact that funds in fact were eliminated for our share of this in the 08 Omnibus Bill. I don't believe that that represents the true will of the U.S. Certainly it is an embarrassment to us. It does jeopardize our partnership status. It has detracted from the confidence that other countries have in us as an international partner. So there is no question that this was an event that has hurt. However, President Bush has requested increased funds for this program in his 2009 budget request to Congress. I hope that Congress will respond with an appropriations bill soon enough so that other countries can see that we do mean to carry forward our obligation to see this thing through. So it is important. This administration is trying to make it work, and I know that many members of Congress want to see it work as well. So let us keep our fingers crossed for the future of this important project.
Another issue that's sort of near and dear to me is the fact that we talk about Africa, we talk about Asia. When we talk about scientific, exposure outside of Brazil, Latin America is an orphan culturally and economically to us so much, and it's our own backyard. I just get frustrated when I see major emphasis on things like biofuels in Indonesia, but not in Nicaragua. Is there a cultural or institutional barrier for us not doing more outreach into Latin America, especially Central America, which has been the orphan?
Let me say one thing about Central America. There are some important assets. The U.S., as a matter of fact, the Smithsonian Institution has an important tropical studies program in Panama. We do look to countries that have unique ecological and archaeological assets for cooperation and partnerships. There are very important archaeological sites, as you know, spread throughout South America and Central America. And U.S. archaeologists work with local archaeologists and scholars in those countries to preserve and study those sites. We also have important programs in astronomy because the southern hemisphere is blocked to our telescopes here in the U.S., and there are some excellent sites in Chile. Perhaps our Dr. Bement can talk to this, that where we have important scientific stations. So we are looking for what I referred to earlier as receptor sites in those countries, and trying to develop further relationships with those countries.
We have strong partnerships with most of the countries in Central America as well as in South America. Dr. Marburger mentioned Chile, you mentioned Brazil, but we have strong partnerships with Argentina, with Colombia, with many other countries in South America. In Central America, there are many important research activities going on that have to do with biodiversity and natural medicines. There's a World Materials Network that is interconnected with most of the countries now in South America. The Foundation has worked with the Inter-American Development Bank and with the Organization of American States to develop programs that will build capacity, not only in Central America, but also in South America. So I would say that South America and Central America are about on par with almost anything we're doing elsewhere in the world. I think we're paying attention to it.
And if I could just add to that real quickly, yeah, we have 4 or 5 S&T agreements with countries in Central and South America. One of them, the Brazilian S&T relationship, has been raised to a higher political level, and we're quite engaged in all these. And I should say also that Dr. Marburger plays and Dr. Bement have played huge roles in those relationships under the S&T agreements.
Thank you, Mr. Rayburn. Go ahead, briefly. We've got those buzzers mean we have a vote shortly, so we'll wrap up shortly.
I would just like to say, but we're still not doing enough, and I'd like to put Mexico on the table as well.
Yeah, that's my concern. Is Central America and Southern Mexico has basically been a black hole, and we talk about Colombia, we talk about Brazil, but it's almost as if we're looking right over our neighbors. But go ahead, Doctor. I'm sorry.
No, I just wanted to say that I think we need to do more. Absolutely. And the other thing is that bringing together, this is one of the things that's really important, is just bringing together scientists to begin collaborations is an enormously important diplomatic tool. Sorry, but it just takes a little bit of money.
I want to commend our witnesses. Ms. Bilbray, good question. To wrap up on that and maybe tie that into something Dr. Bartlett said, Ms. Miotke talked about the science and technology partnerships. One of the challenges is we don't fund that. And one of the questions I think this committee needs to do, one of our tasks as members of Congress, we've heard from our witnesses, we've read their testimony, is advocate vigorously with our colleagues to set aside some of this money. Because within an agency budget, be it USAID or one of the various directed agencies, other directed agencies, the task of international scientific collaboration can too easily be the easy cut. It's not the urgent thing like getting food to somebody's door, but again, Dr. Bartlett's seed corn analogy. So instead of building capacity among their scientists to solve their own problems and maybe some of ours, that may easily be the first thing to be cut. When we sign scientific and technology agreements with these countries, there's almost never funding that goes with it. It's sort of, we want to work together, but our funding to even fund our own side of that is limited, but then there are statutory or restraints on what we can give to the other country to participate. So the handshake is important, but we need to back that up with more substantive. And I think that's our committee's task, is to educate our colleagues in the Congress and, frankly, to vote that way when these appropriations and other measures come forward. There's a great article by Norm Newrider, which I'll introduce into the record, but also share with my colleagues about the whole broad role of science at the Department of State. But one of the issues he makes is making sure there are dedicated funds for this purpose. I would very much like to thank our witnesses for your work. Some incredibly eloquent testimony today and inspiring testimony, and we appreciate your daily work and the information you've provided this committee. I want to thank my colleagues for their participation. As I've said before, this is one of the central issues that this committee will occupy itself with over the year. Dr. Fedoroff, I'm very excited about this, I don't know, gathering is maybe the best word. Maybe you've got another word of university directors, and we hope to learn more about that in the future. With that, this hearing stands adjourned with the gratitude of the committee. Thank you.